This is the melee units section of the tier list. Alright, let's start off with the Guardsman. Immediate S tier, although he may not be arguably, quote, the best in all cases, he is still the most well-rounded melee unit. His only downside is having the lowest DPS of any unit that isn't a builder. In fact, I think he does less damage than the space transports. The Guardsman has 350 health, which is shared with mount units. No other melee unit, or ranged unit for that matter, has this much health. So, what the Guardsman can be used essentially is a tank unit with surprisingly decent speed. Now, I do feel like the Guardsman is a very balanced unit for being just a melee unit. He's still very, very weak. He's one of the weakest in terms of overall power, but the fact he has so much health, he's just a tank and he just survives everything. And he's decently fast, so you can collect him, send him out early to collect gold bricks while still having a decent melee unit. As for the skeleton, though, he's C tier material. The skeleton, I'm very mixed about how he works. Basically, even though they show with the same damage stars, the DPS value thing that the game renders with just one, the skeleton actually does more damage than the Guardsman. Now, having 3 speed is great for collecting gold bricks early, but he has such low health, he does not survive anything. Even though being fast does help him in a approaching scenario for attacking, having such low health and still, even though I said he does more damage with the Guardsman, it's still low damage, so it's not even a good amount of damage for him to deal. So he doesn't do a lot of damage. He has super low health, and his only upside is that he has 3 stars of speed, which is kind of cool. Also, he is 10 gold more expensive than most melee units. He costs 110, while the Guardsman costs 100. Now for the Dwarf, he's actually A tier. I used to put him a lot lower because I used to think he was just, worst trooper with a little bit more view distance, but view distance matters quite a bit, actually. A surprising amount of units actually might be better off with higher view distance. When you have a group of, say, Guardsmen in a cluster, they only have, I say, about 5 view distance. So when a catapult comes along with 8 range, they'll be outside of the view distance, so the Guardsmen will not go out of their way to attack. While a Dwarf with 7 view distance, their aggro range, I believe, is 1 square outside of their view distance or within, but when a catapult approaches, the Dwarf can actually recognize that there's a catapult over there, and he'll actually go over there automatically. So with the Guardsmen and most other units with low view distance, you have to micromanage these units that don't have good view distance. I didn't even mention his other stats. Sure, he has 1 speed, he is on the slower end of melee units, but he does decent damage. He has the 2-star ranking. Although he doesn't do the most damage of the melee units, he has respectable damage. I don't think the Dwarf is going to be a make it or break it for a lot of people. Most of the time, I don't like using the Dwarf, honestly. He still feels really weak. He only has 25 more health than the Skeleton, which does help him, boost him up a little bit. And he does do significantly more damage than the Skeleton and Guardsman. But the view distance is really what carries the Dwarf. As for the Troll, though, I think he kind of sits alongside the Skeleton. The Troll, I feel like, is a lot worse than the dwarf. Even though the troll has view distance, they're the only two units, melee units, with 7 view distance, while all the others have 5. The problem is that the troll doesn't do a lot of damage. Sure, he's faster. I gave the guardsman praise for having the 2-star speed, but he has a lot of health to back that up, and he's a little bit more valuable than the troll. In fact, if the troll and the guardsman fought, they would likely tie. And I believe the guardsman's high health, extremely high health, really helps him out. Versus the troll, who does the same damage as the skeleton, has 25 more health than the skeleton, which is like a very, very little bit of health. The troll's kind of just a budget skeleton in a way. Like, he costs, 10 less than the skeleton, so that kind of works out. The oarsman, B tier, does the least amount of damage, like the guardsman, but he does have 300 health and 3 speed. But he costs 120 instead of 110. I think he's far more valuable than the skeleton, because the skeleton's low health really brings him down when attacking bases, while the oarsman is kind of like a lesser tank than the guardsman. I still don't think he's really great, but his low damage really hurts him. But I still think he performs better than the skeleton solely because of health and the ability to tank hits. He has the same amount of health as an archer, and the mount units that I consider not viable. So yeah, B tier. Swordsman. He's kind of hard to place down because the dwarf does everything better than him. In fact, the trooper does everything better than him as well, but we'll talk about the trooper in just a bit. He has the same stats at face value as the dwarf. He does 2-star damage, he has 1 speed and 250 health and 100 cost. However, the swordsman is just worse than the dwarf because he doesn't have the view distance, and the swordsman does less damage to buildings, while the dwarf doesn't. Now, melee units attacking buildings is very rare. In fact, I would say it doesn't come up a lot. But yeah, the swordsman's kind of just alright. Like, if you just want a swordsman because you think he looks cool, you can pick him. Like, for the most part, these melee units, you can get by with them. How should I say this? Like, if you pick the troll, you're not gonna lose the game if you just pick a troll. You'll lose the game because you might have picked way worse units outside of melee units, because melee units don't make that big of a difference in the overall meta scheme, but they do affect it, at least. Especially for the early game. For the swordsman, if you just want to build a few at the beginning and then start focusing on your range and mount units, go right on ahead. The swordsman's fine for that. He's stronger than these two. Sure, he's slower, but I feel like the power, having stronger melee units, is better than just more unique melee units. And speaking of strong melee units, Trooper. He's the most powerful of the melee units. He can beat any of these guys in a 1v1. In fact, he can beat most range units in a 1v1. Like, he's really strong. It's because he has the highest DPS of the melee and range units, actually. The dwarf and swordsman have around 22.5 DPS, while the trooper has, I believe, 31.25 DPS, somewhere around there. It's a pretty big number, and his DPS really shows, because when he goes up to a unit, he'll actually shred them. Like, multiple troopers going up against a few archers is like really scary. However, the trooper still suffers in terms of speed, but he is the cheapest of the melee units. He costs 90, while most of the others cost 100, which a 10 stud difference, or 10 gold difference, isn't that much, but it should be noted. And the Trooper also has a very unique health value of 275, which is 25 less than the Oarsman, but 25 more than the Swordsman, Troll, and Dwarf, which is very interesting. The drone, I'm gonna say top of B tier. He feels weird. Almost like he could be really good, like really strong early on, especially as an early rush unit. He has 2 speed and 2 damage and 225 health, which is the least, tied by the skeleton. And he does feel like a more effective skeleton in many ways because he actually can deal the damage. It's still the same damage as the Dwarf and Swordsman. No other unit has the same damage as the Trooper. While the drone, he feels weak in a way. When he's going up against, say, a bunch of catapults, they just melt right away because their health is so low. I think they're like a little bit stronger than a Guardsman, but slightly weaker than Swordsman and Dwarf. In fact, I think he's a better Troll, even though, again, he has 25 less health than the Troll. I think if the skeleton's a better Troll, then the drone is clearly a better Troll. And that's kind of the issue with the Troll. Like, he's unique, he isn't outclassed, but he just feels extremely underwhelming. Most of everybody from B tier kind of feel a little bit underwhelming. I mean, if you want a 3-speed unit, I say either one works. In fact, the skeleton is actually stronger than the Oarsman in a 1v1. But I value the health of an Oarsman more than the damage of a skeleton. So yeah, that's about it. We're now going on to the range units. And before I continue, I should note that the ranged unit DPS values are actually all consistent within each other, unlike the melee units. However, their speed values are inconsistent, unlike the melee units, whose speed values are mostly consistent. I'll get into that later on. First off, we have the Archer. He is considered by many to be the best range unit. I mean, almost all of the King's units are really, really good. They're near S tier, except for, say, the Knight and their transport ship. But all that said, Archer's still great. You can obviously tell with his stat pool just in the general stat screen that is extremely inconsistent with a lot of other units, but 300 health, 2-star DPS, which is around 21.2 DPS for him. He has 3 speed. He isn't actually the fastest ranged unit. There are actually faster ranged units. And he has 150 cost, which is generally considered as worse than 100 cost. However, Archer's the strongest ranged unit to pick. You can't go wrong with the Archer. There's not much else to say. Crossbowman, I'm just gonna say B tier. Objectively worse Archer in literally every way. He has less health, 50 less health. He has less range, 4 range, while the Archer has 5. He's slower. He's the slowest ranged unit. He has 2 stars of speed, so he's just worse Archer. Poor guy. He looks cool too. Gunman, kind of B tier as well. Yeah, just B tier. He still has the same cost issue as the Archer. You know, honestly, C tier. Yeah, he has 200 health, which is the lowest health of the ranged units. Yeah, sure, he is the fastest. He is tied with the fastest, excuse me. But he still has high cost. He's just weak. Like having high speed for a range unit is like a bonus. It doesn't really affect your placement too much. It's just kind of like oh yeah, this guy is the fastest, and this guy is the slowest. In fact, I would even go as far to say that a slower range unit might be better in some instances. However, the slowest range units are pretty bad in just every other way in terms of stats. So I very rarely just advise not picking them anyway, because your mount units are most likely to be of the same speed or even a little bit faster than your range units. Rifleman, worse gunman. In fact, he has less range than the gunman, he's slower than gunman, and he still has the same health issue of 200. He's just like, of all the ranged units with the 2 damage or 2 DPS star value, he should be your last pick. Like, he's bad. I also think a lot of these the cooler looking range units are considered to be some of the worst ones. Sadly, I love the look of the Rifleman, but he's not that good. But for the Islander, he's also S tier. A lot of people do say he is actually better than the Archer. Now, at first glance, he does look to be worse than the Archer, with 50 less health, just like the Crossbowman. But unlike the Crossbowman, he has 100 cost, which by many is considered to be a huge positive, because you can use him way better in the early game, while the Archer, you kind of have to build him later on when you get more money early on in the game, because you usually spam melee units early on while you don't spam range units. However, range units are really strong, like surprisingly strong. So having those early on actually help you with your early game defense, and having low cost just boosts that up. Yeah, for every 2 archers, you can make 3 islanders. And that is a big difference between the 2 of them. I still think either or is still completely viable depending on the map. Smaller maps, I would actually consider the Islander better, while larger, more longer paced maps, I'd say the Archer's better. And for the Ninja, he's A tier. I think he's like super duper close to being like actually really strong. So he is kind of just, he's better gunman essentially. He has the same high speed as a gunman, so he is the best, fastest ranged unit. However, he does have the low health issue of 200, which is unfortunate. But he does have also another benefit alongside his 100 cost, like what we talked with the Islander. He actually builds faster. He has a build time almost as close to melee units, because range units actually build a little bit slower than melee units. So I believe he builds 30 frames slower, which is about a second in game, while every other unit builds about 3 or 4 seconds slower. Well, the Ninja builds like 1 second slower than melee units. So having the Ninja is basically like an early game spamming unit, and having 100 cost is just another bonus, like with the Islander. However, he still does have issues as a range unit with 200 health, meaning he can die pretty quickly. And then we get to the space units, all 4 of whom deal around 15 DPS, which is less than a skeleton, mind you, but it is more than a guardsman. So they're kind of like in between a skeleton and a guardsman in terms of DPS. And that's pretty bad, honestly. Having 1-star DPS just as a whole just kind of just makes all of them worse than a 2 damage range unit. I mean, the reason why you pick a range unit is so you can have that like background damage over everybody else. They usually are the last ones to die in your group because they're so far back. And because of that, they should be the ones to deal the most damage over time. Now, I believe health is still important for the range units, but Commando is arguably one of the worst. His only upside is 300 health. That's about it. He has 150 cost. He has 5 range, which is cool. There's only 3 units with 4 range, and the Commando is kind of just meh. Sure, he has 300 health, but if the Commando goes up against a ninja, the ninja wins. Like, if they 1v1, the ninja will win. Even though the ninja has far less health, that low DPS really hurts the Commando. Now, having low speed, as I said earlier, is a positive, but that low damage is... It hurts. And fun fact, the Crossbowman and the Commando are the only 2 range units with the 2-star DPS value. They are tied with the slowest speed. So it is kind of cool. You might have a niche with those 2, but they're so bad in every other way that they're not considered useful. The Laser Trooper, also F tier. Him and the Commando can like swap for who's worse than who's. Now the Laser Trooper is tied with the Gunman and Ninja for fastest speed, which is cool, but that's kind of all he has, really, is high speed. He still has a low damage. He has 4 range. Speaking of, all the range units on the villain side have 4 range, which is the Laser Trooper, Rifleman, and Crossbowman. All have 4 range. They're the only ones with 4 range for some reason. And, 150 cost. Laser Trooper just feels weak. Space Police, he actually is a little bit slower than the Laser Trooper, but he does cost 100. And I think at the very least 100 cost is better than, and he also has more range than the Laser Trooper too. But yeah, 100 cost is better than 150 cost, and just like sacrificing like the tiniest bit of speed. And yeah, that's kind of it for the Space Police. He's like a little bit better. I still think the Rifleman's better than the Space Police, but they're still bad. The Space Criminal, on the other hand, is the best of the faster 1 damage range units. In fact, he's the only one that isn't outclassed by anyone, because most of these guys, the Crossman, Gunman, Rifleman, Space Police, Commando, and Laser Trooper, are all considered to be outclassed, as in their stats are considered to be objectively worse than another unit. Another unit, it has just straight up better stats than them. Well, the Space Criminal doesn't have that. He actually outclasses the space. He has the cost of the Space Police and the speed of the Laser Trooper. So he is unique, but he's still pretty bad, honestly. Like having the same speed as the Space Police, honestly, his low damage is just, it just really hurts him. It's unfortunate for these types of units too, because I feel like if they did something else, they would be way better, but they're just really bad. Like if the lasered guys had like more range, like a significant more range, or they like pierce through buildings and units, or they did something else besides just low damage, they would be so much better. So yeah, the Crossbowmen I wouldn't even consider picking over these top 3. These top 3 units are considered the best, and I think the Ninja is one of the coolest looking units, which is awesome, but I prefer the look of the Rifleman the most. I just like how they look. But yeah, these are the ranged units. We're now on to mount units, which are the most important of your team, for the ground units at least. Specials are your most important unit overall, but your mounts are very, very important for your ground unit and for your like general army in the late game. And for the most part, the mount unit meta is mostly the same, as you can see from the general stat screen for the game, but there are some like hidden stats and values that you should at least take note of. Let's start with the knight. D tier, honestly. 300 health. I praised the archer, the commando for having 300 health, but for a mount unit, when compared to other mount units, 300 health is bad. Really, really bad. They just melt from towers. Like, they can't do anything to towers. And on top of that, the knight doesn't really have anything significant in terms of speed. He is a little bit faster than the Gripply and the cavalry, and he does have the highest damage of all the mounted units. However, there's another mount unit that just ties his damage. In fact, he does less damage to buildings as well. He still is usable, and he's unique, but he's pretty much like a worse of mostly everybody else. The Skeleton Knight is just bad. You already know this. He does less damage. He's just worse knight. He does less damage than the knight. He has the same speed as the knight, but he's just worse. Like, you can just see from the stat screen, he's just bad. Like, there's nothing else to say. He's just a bad unit. Horseman, B tier, yeah. He is tied with the Skeleton Knight with the lowest damage, but he does have 400 health to back him up. And he has the 4-star speed, which is, he's fast, and he's pretty tanky with that speed. That being said, though, his damage is really noticeable, especially when attacking buildings, because he does, I'm pretty sure, like 10 or 15 less damage to buildings, which hurts him a lot. Especially when considering that the rest of the mount units up here are just so much stronger than him. He feels pretty weak. And I'm just going to skip over these two for the Gravrunner, who is, I believe, a little bit better than the Horseman. He does more damage than the Horseman. And he has the same speed as the Horseman, with like 50 less health. And he is one of the two mounts who does normal damage to buildings. So that's just a plus over the Horseman. And I believe they tie in a 1v1, though I feel like the damage for the Gravrunner is much more significant than the Horseman. I still do feel like, compared to the top two, the Gravrunner does suffer against them, but he still unique in that he is fast and he can go around collecting gold bricks if you don't like collecting gold bricks early on. So like, if you just want to send him out early, you can try to do that. So yeah, the Gravrunner, he's pretty good. He's not the best, but he's all right. As for the cavalry and Gripply, you can swap them over between each other interchangeably. Although on the stat page it does look like the cavalry is better with 50 more health, while the Gripply does the same damage. But actually, the Gripply does more damage than the cavalry, enough for them to tie in a 1v1, and the Gripply also does normal damage to buildings. All the other mount units besides Gravrunner do around 10 or 15 less damage to buildings, so that's also a positive over the cavalry. I do think that health is more important when comparing these two, unlike the Gravrunner and Horseman. The Horseman's damage is so low, you really notice it, while the Gravrunner and Cavalry do the same damage, I believe. And when comparing these two, I do like the Cavalry's health. I feel like the survivability in a group against a group of cavalry can beat a group of Gripplies most of the time. They're pretty overpowered, honestly, for just mount units in general. The rest of them, they just feel a lot weaker. In fact, the Grav Runner, he's a pretty big step down from S to A, in my opinion. So that'll do it for today. But thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.